think if it came down to Pennsylvania, for example, and we actually had to look under the hood and see how the election's actually being run, I don't think we'd be too happy with what we see.
Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer. As the old song goes, there's got to be a morning after. That's like my mom's kind of song. That's not my kind of song. But the question is, what will we know by then? Millions of Americans have already voted in the 2020 presidential election, but just half of all American registered voters believe there will be a clear winner a day or two after November 3rd. The potential for problems is endless. Record numbers of mail-in ballots that must be counted, hundreds of lawyers waiting in the wings to litigate in swing states, and all sorts of foreign interference and voter suppression. That's our topic today, and more, as we look at voting in America. It was 1966. As the civil rights movement grew in the United States, then Senator Bobby Kennedy traveled to Cape Town, South Africa, at the height of apartheid, to deliver his famous Ripple of Hope speech. Among the many memorable lines, he said this:
"There is a Chinese curse which says, 'May he live in interesting times.'"
His interesting times, America of the 1960s, have a lot of similarities to ours today. Protests in the streets, civil unrest over systemic racism, and deep ideological battles about equal rights. We can check all those boxes today. But there's an important distinction to make, one that could have far wider implications for the future of our democracy. Tensions were high in the 1960s, no doubt, but so was trust. Back in 1964, 77% of Americans believed their government would do the right thing all or most of the time. Can you believe that? Today, that number is 20%. And faith in how we choose the people who run that government is also eroding. Exhibit A, the Electoral College. Sounds like an ivy-covered building nestled away in New England, but it's a process, not a place, and it's one that's spelled out in the U.S. Constitution. Here's how it works. States are assigned electors equal to their number of representatives in Congress, plus 2 more, 1 for each senator. It's a system that gives states with smaller populations an advantage, perhaps too much of one, when it comes to electing a president. For example, Wyoming, which has 3 electors, the minimum allocated by law, an electoral vote represents around 190,000 people, while each of New York's 29 electors represent nearly 4 times that number. And with a mostly winner-take-all system, even the tiniest margin of victory in the state can deliver a big bounty of electoral votes towards the 270 needed to become the next president of the United States. 2 of the last 5 presidential elections were won by candidates who actually lost the popular vote. George W. Bush in 2000 and Donald J. Trump back in 2016. He trailed Hillary Clinton by nearly 3 million votes. Since then, the number of Americans who say it's time to end that system has grown overall, from about half in 2016 to nearly 2/3 today. So is the Electoral College hanging by a Chad? That depends on which side of the aisle you're on. Unsurprisingly, attitudes about the system divide sharply down party lines. A vast majority of Democrats want the Electoral College repealed. Republicans, not so much. That's another big difference from the 1960s, by the way, when a roughly equal number of Democrats and Republicans wanted the popular vote to determine the presidency. Add in a pandemic, which is changing how we vote, foreign interference from Russia, China, even Iran, and historic polarization that has deeply divided the nation, and our times surely rival Bobby Kennedy's on the interesting scale. He may have been wrong about it being a Chinese curse. There is, however, an old proverb that goes something like this: better to be a dog in tranquil times than a human in times of chaos. Moose agrees. How chaotic the results of this presidential election will be remains to be seen. But as my guest today tells us, it certainly won't be tranquil, and its implications for our democracy will have repercussions far beyond November 3rd. Professor Rick Hasen, who's at the University of California, Irvine, and the author of Election Meltdown: Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy. A timely topic indeed, sir. Thank you so much for being on GZERO World.
It's great to be with you.
So your book came out last February, right around the disastrous Iowa caucuses that certainly were not a good foretelling of things to come. But before the pandemic hit, you cited a confluence of forces that could lead to a disaster on November 3rd. Increased voter suppression efforts is one. What's the most damaging instance of that you've seen so far?
The obvious thing that's happened since my book came out is the coronavirus hit. And we're trying to run an election during a pandemic. And it's just been amazing to me, not a single thing, but a confluence of mostly Republican states that have passed laws that are making it harder to register and to vote during a pandemic, or that have failed to change laws and have been fighting tooth and nail in federal and state courts to prevent safe and fair voting during the pandemic.
Now, early turnout so far at least, has been extraordinarily strong. Would you say that those efforts have largely failed, given how much interest there is, or they've succeeded and we're just not seeing it?
So when I write about voter suppression, I'm not necessarily talking about it affecting the outcome of elections. I think that's a really tough question to answer because, in fact, there's a backlash. We just saw a recent story in Politico about African-American voters in Georgia who are coming out in droves because they know that state officials are doing things that are making it harder for them to register and vote. I'm more concerned in the book about efforts to suppress the vote undermining the legitimacy of the election. The kind of language you hear from Donald Trump makes Republicans believe that Democrats are trying to steal the election, and the responses to make it harder to vote convince Democrats that Republicans are trying to steal the election. So both sides end up, because of these efforts at making it harder to vote, end up seeing the other side as trying to cheat.
Maybe to jump into that, I mean, kind of irrespective of the electoral outcome, is it your view that large numbers of Americans are going to feel that the election was stolen from their candidate?
Well, I think a large part of this is going to depend on the margin of victory. What we know is that when there's a hard-fought election these days, the losers tend to believe that the election was not done fairly, and especially if it's on the Trump side where there's a loss. The president has been repeatedly stating just about every day that the election is rigged.
The only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that.
So I'm sure that no matter what happens, if Trump loses, there's going to be a core of his supporters who are going to believe that it's stolen. But if it's very close and it ends up in the courts, that kind of protracted situation, I think, will lead many Americans to believe that it was an unfair election.
Now, you've also talked about foreign intervention. Clearly, in the run-up to the 2016 elections, that was a significant issue, one we were all aware of, one that the Obama administration did not respond to particularly effectively or very quickly. This time around, we haven't had as much news about that. A little bit on Russia and Iran in the last week.
We have confirmed that some voter registration information has been obtained by Iran and separately by Russia.
Though frankly, not egregious activities if we see at least what we found publicly. And very interestingly, in the last few days, President Putin himself seemingly helping the Biden cause by saying Hunter Biden's not really a big thing. We want to engage in arms control, if Biden comes in. Has this played out to a lesser degree than you might have expected a few months ago?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, I think the goalposts have moved. We know from intelligence reports that were reported in the New York Times that the Russians have done what they did in 2016 in terms of breaking into state voter registration databases. Now, not necessarily doing anything to change any of the data on there, but that itself can undermine people's confidence in the election. We know that the Russians and others have been engaged in disinformation campaigns just like they were in 2016. So I think the news is just so flooded with things happening every day that in a normal world, these things would be major news. They would be, on the front page of the New York Times for days. But yet there's, with the coronavirus and everything else going on, it is something that is just seen as just another thing we have to deal with to get through an election during the pandemic. And in terms of Putin's latest comments, I think when you've lost Vladimir Putin, I think Putin is hearing the polls as well. And I take this as actually a hopeful sign because I think it means that one of my greatest fears, which I talk about in Election Meltdown, which would be a cyber attack emanating out of Russia on on the power grid during an election in a swing state is somewhat less likely. So that's a little bit of relief, but it's still a lot of interference in our election.
Yeah, certainly if Putin is a week in advance of the election trying to say that he would want to have good relations, constructive relations, if Biden were president, I mean, a massive cyber attack by the Russians against the U.S. power grid would tend to undermine that strategy, yes?
Yes, but there are, of course, other countries that also have designs on messing with the United States election. So I'm not completely relaxed about how Election Day is going to go. I'll be happy when we're through Election Day.
You talk also about administrative incompetence. We've never hosted an election before in the middle of this kind of health crisis. What do you do? I mean, what do you've seen some of this already in primary season. Where do you think people should be watching most carefully to see if that becomes a truly explosive set of problems?
Well, the first thing we know is that no election is conducted perfectly, and that elections have all kinds of problems. We're going to have more problems because we're running an election during a pandemic. It's much more expensive. Congress only came up with about a tenth of the money that it takes to run elections efficiently in a pandemic, meaning that things are going to be done in a sloppy way. I'm especially concerned about Pennsylvania and to some extent Michigan and Wisconsin, three key Midwestern states that were part of Trump's Electoral College coalition, and states where they're getting a flood of absentee ballots, where they don't have the experience counting that many absentee ballots, where the amount of litigation over these ballots is now on its second trip to the United States Supreme Court, just out of Pennsylvania. And so I think if it came down to Pennsylvania, for example, and we actually had to look under the hood and see how the election's actually being run, I don't think we'd be too happy with what we see. And so I'm really hoping there's something called the election administrator's prayer, which is, Lord, let this election not be close. I really don't want it to be close in a place like Pennsylvania. One way or the other, Trump or Biden winning a clear victory would be much better for the country in terms of the election's legitimacy than the kind of hand-to-hand combat that we would see if the election went into overtime.
Is it a foregone conclusion in your mind that if the election is reasonably close, that it is aggressively contested on both sides?
I think there's no question about that. I mean, think back to 20 years ago, Bush versus Gore. People felt that Gore was not aggressive enough, and here he was, fighting for recounts, and there were almost 24 lawsuits. I mean, now we're in a social media era. We're much more polarized. Both sides see this as a kind of existential election about the future of the United States. So I think it would be litigated as much as possible. What we really need to see is a victory that's outside the margin of litigation, which means we don't come down to a very close vote in a swing state that's crucial for the Electoral College, or some kind of massive failure like a cyber attack or something else, a hurricane, something else that makes it impossible for someone to be able to vote in one of these key states.
So if it is contested, it is close, how much does a 6-3 conservative split in the Supreme Court actually matter?
So not only would it have to be close, right? It would have to be so close, like think Florida 2000 close, which was, within a few thousand votes, later got whittled down to a little over 500 votes.
Stand by. CNN right now is moving our earlier declaration of Florida back to the too close to call column.
Have to be that close, and then there would have to be something worth fighting over. And it would have to be crafted in such a way as to, come up with a theory that would swing the outcome of the election, depending on how the Supreme Court rules. I think if it gets to that and we get to the Supreme Court, we've seen the justices end up voting in ways that line up with their ideological and partisan preferences. I don't think that's because these justices are consciously trying to help their parties, but because the kind of theories that are proposed to them are ones that appeal to that side. So we'll see. But I think we're talking about a low probability event. Highly catastrophic, but low probability.
Look a little farther on. I mean, once we get through this massive, messy thing, what's something that a future administration could do to help really reduce the dangers that an election seems delegitimized by so many American citizens?
Well, there's a lot that could be done. I mean, I think long-term, I would like to see the United States join with every other advanced democracy around the world and have a system of national nonpartisan election administration with an electoral body that is insulated from day-to-day politics like the Federal Reserve. That's not happening anytime soon. It might require a constitutional amendment. I'd also like to see the right to vote guaranteed in the U.S. Constitution, which might surprise you. It's not. We only have our rights framed in terms of the negative. Don't discriminate on the basis of race or gender or things like that. In the medium term or the short to medium term, you can imagine if Biden wins and Democrats take back control of both houses of Congress, they could pass election reform bills that would provide certain standards that states would need to meet in terms of early voting, in terms of the technology that they offer, in terms of uniform rules for voting by absentee. There's all kinds of things that could be done. The question is going to be what's going to be on the Democrats' agenda if Biden wins, and are they going to have to get rid of the filibuster in order to get meaningful electoral reform happening in, say, the first year of a Biden administration?
Rick, we know the country's very divided right now. The mass media and social media are very divided as well. Any guidelines for how you would like to see both media and social media covering this election, maybe differently than they have in the past, given just how contested and controversial it is proving to be?
So I think two key points here. One, in terms of the media, it's very important that if the election is very close and it comes down to, say, those Midwestern states, which are going to count their ballots slow, that the message is too early to call. That, we don't know who the winner is, and people should have patience. And this doesn't mean that anything nefarious is going on. It just means that it's going to take a while to process those absentee ballots. We're doing this in order to prevent fraud, not to facilitate fraud. And transparency is important from election administrators so that the media can accurately report what's going on, especially if there's disinformation. And that goes to my recommendation for social media, which is that we need to make sure that those companies are removing disinformation about voting. There could be false information about, for example, where, when, and how to vote, especially during a pandemic. Maybe there are false rumors about a candidate being sick on election day or something else going on. And after election day, if we are in a close election period, if you do have Trump claiming that the election is massively infected with fraud and he's making those claims without any basis, then I think it's incumbent on social media companies to be providing accurate information and to direct viewers and listeners to correct sources of information, which are official local and state government bodies that are actually counting the ballots and are announcing official results.
So if on the day, we've already heard that people that are voting on the day are much more likely to vote Republican, people that are voting by mail and voting early are much more likely to vote Democrat. If on the day we have Trump ahead, but there's still a hell of a lot of votes to be counted, and Trump says, as he has intimated that he would on social media, I've won. And he has a press conference, I've won. He puts it out on social media, I've won. If you're the media, if you're social media, what do you do? Do you take those down? Do you put a little disclaimer on the bottom? Do you not allow other people to retweet them? What does one do in that situation?
Yeah, I think it's a really tough situation. First of all, for regular media, they can say the president has claimed this, but election officials say it's too early to call and Biden could still well win, and here's how. Social media, it's a pretty tough thing. I think at the very least, those tweets should be labeled with information to say that this is a contested point and that would direct those who want more information to accurate information about what is being reported about vote totals and when we're likely to know who the winner is. I think, in some senses, we're a little bit inoculated from this because we're all expecting that Trump is going to say he's won, whether he's won or not. And so I think people are on guard for this, and I think that everyone is making contingency plans to deal with that eventuality.
Rick Hasen, he wants you to vote. Thanks for being on the show, man.
Thank you.
That's our show this week. Come back next week, and if you like what you see, and you can handle tearing yourself away for just a moment from the elections, it's really soon, I promise. Take a minute to sign up for GZERO's most excellent morning newsletter. It's called Signal.